Welcome to Biochemistry 603, the Principles of Biochemistry or Biophysics. My name is Professor Hayes Rye. So what is biochemistry and why should you care? So one definition of biochemistry is that it is the study of the structure, organisms, and functions of living matter in molecular terms. Now that definition is based in the conviction that all of the fascinating complexity of the self-organizing matter we think of as life can be explained with the same basic principles of chemistry, physics, and biology that govern everything else in the natural world. All right, so that's perfectly accurate uh, description or definition of biochemistry, but let's see if I can motivate a desire to understand biochemistry in a slightly different way. Consider the following video. That video shows a human tissue culture cell, a PTK2 cell, that's been infected with an intracellular microbial pathogen, bacterial pathogen, known as Listeria monocytogenes. Now, Listeria is a small gram-positive rod. It infects a huge number of people every year. Almost everybody on the planet has been infected with Listeria probably more than once. But about 2,500 people a year in the United States are seriously infected, and about a quarter of those are going to die. Listeria causes gastrointestinal distress, and in serious infections, subsequent infection of the central nervous system. Infection is almost always from contaminated food. And infection in pregnant women in particular carries a very high risk of miscarriage and stillbirth. So this is a serious health problem in most of the places around the world. But it's never been a serious issue in general, because even in serious infections, antibiotics permitted relatively straightforward treatment of Listeria. However, as with so many other microbial, bacterial pathogens nowadays, in the last 20 years, isolates of L. monocytogenes have begun appearing that have very, very high antibiotic resistance. Okay, so if you look at that video, right, what's a really striking thing to you about it? They move, right? Those little bacterial rods motor about inside this living cell, making decisions about what they're going to do next, deciding whether they're going to try and invade the neighboring cell, making copies of themselves. And they do all of this without a brain or a central nervous system or anything we would recognize as a sort of, decision-making apparatus. And yet they make these decisions and they do these things and they're active. How on earth does that work, right? How, right? So that's the kind of thing at a very basic level we want to understand with biochemistry, and biochemistry gives us the tools to do that. But we don't want to just describe what's happening, right? In simple words, right? We don't want to just descriptively say, oh, well, it's there and it moves around. We want to do better than that. We want physical and chemical explanations of this process. In particular, we want testable, preferably quantitative models of how these molecular events take place that result in something like a living system, that are based in the mechanics of chemistry and the physics of the process, that give us the deepest possible understanding and give us models that we can then use to understand new phenomena, right? So that's really our goal in biochemistry. All right, so why? Why does that matter? Well, why would you care? There are several different ways you could answer that question. The first, I would argue, is just because you're curious. You want to know how it works, right? Knowledge for the sake of knowledge is a noble pursuit, one that perhaps doesn't get quite the level of recognition nowadays as it once did, but it is still an extremely good reason for trying to understand how things work in the physical world. Can't always tell where the next discovery is going to come from. So just understanding how something works is a super important thing to try and do, right? But there are also good applied reasons. I just mentioned one, the need to develop a drug, perhaps, can be a strongly motivating reason to try and understand this process. At the same time, sometimes studying the basic properties of a system like this give you entries into new materials or new technologies. So there are all kinds of reasons why we'd want to understand a biological process like this in a really deep way using biochemistry and biophysics. Okay, well, we can think about biochemistry, or I like to think about biochemistry in three rough areas. The first is cellular molecular structure. The second is energetics and mechanism. And the third is information storage, retrieval, and processing. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have a chance to spend much time, very little at all actually, on information storage. We're going to spend most of our time focusing here on these first two areas: cellular molecular structure, energetics, and mechanism. Okay, so if you think back to that listeria example, after movement, after the sort of like horrifying activity of this swarm of bacteria in this living cell, what's one of the next most obvious things about it? Well, it was structure, right? The bacteria had a distinctive structure compared to the eukaryotic cell, which had a distinctive structure, identifying it as something that was a eukaryotic versus a prokaryotic cell. So understanding basic structure, physical and chemical structure, is central, or a central theme of biochemistry, and one we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about. And sort of maxim in biochemistry that sort of captures this idea is this statement that form is function and function is form in biochemistry or in biology. Now, when you think about structure, it can mean a lot of different things. Populations, for example, have structure, right? Different populations can be structured in completely different ways. And populations are, of course, made of different organisms, and each organism has a distinctive structure. Organisms are composed of tissues, and tissues, as you obviously would know, are made of different particular ways. Heart tissue is different from skin, is different from kidney, is different from liver, right? And tissues are composed of different cells that have unique structures depending on their function. Of course, there's the distinction between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells as well. And then eukaryotic, so all cells have different subcellular structure, and this is highly elaborated in eukaryotic cells, which have all these organelles and whatnot, right? Now, we're not going to spend much time talking about structure down this hierarchy. We're primarily going to be focused at this next level, which is the molecules involved in the construction of different organisms, right? We'll crawl a little bit back up this hierarchy to organelles and cell structure a bit, but we'll spend most of our time down here talking about molecules. And there are four large classes of biological molecule. One, of course, needs to remember, you hopefully know about all of these, is of course proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about nucleic acids. We're just not going to have time. We'll spend most of our time talking about proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Okay. So turning back to that listeria video again, other than the fact that it had structure, the first thing that I sort of pointed out, the first sort of horrifying idea, was this movement, the fact these things are swarming about inside this living cell. Well, that swarming about requires energy. And so a really deep fundamental theme in biology is understanding how energy is created and how it moves about between different parts of a cell to get things done, right? So where's that energy coming from? How is it utilized? And really, when you think about it, you might remember this, that the energy needs of an organism like this listeria are far greater than however much energy it needs to even make copies of itself and to motor about and whatnot. All living organisms spend an enormous amount of energy avoiding one fundamental truth of our universe, which is that in the long run, the disorder of everything is favored, right? We'll come back to that in a little while. So where does that energy come from that makes this movement of these listeria possible? Well, ultimately, on this planet, comes from the sun, right? All the energy for everything that happens in the biosphere on this planet ultimately is coming from the sun. or from a previous star, if you want to think about it. I'll mention that again at a later point in the course. So how does that energy go from the star into this Listeria organism, right? Well, most of you probably know the answer to that. It's through photosynthesis, right? Plants on this planet capture radiant sunlight and then pack it into the structure of different carbohydrate molecules. And the trick for organisms like Listeria, or us, is to figure out how to get that energy back out again, right? By taking those molecules that plants have synthesized, breaking them back apart, and extracting useful energy in the process. And so what we want to understand is another and really important, deep, fundamental theme in biochemistry is how that energy extraction process works, how that energy utilization works. Now, to provide something other than just a descriptive answer, like they do it, we need to begin thinking about building up a formal system that lets us think about energy in quantitative terms. And this, of course, leads us to think about one of the great intellectual edifices of modern science, which is, of course, thermodynamics.